From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
And hello again. Welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on Can TV. I'm Ken Davis. So glad you're joining us on what's turned out to be a kind of a busy week in local news here in Chicago. We've got some kind of a, what do you want to call it, a settlement, a memorandum of agreement, an understanding of some kind between the teachers and the CTU and CPS, and we don't really quite understand how it's going to work or how it's going to get paid for, but we're told that it might avert a strike, and that would be good news for everybody if we could just understand how it's going to work. And we also have we've got food fights erupting in the city council, and joining us, our old friend Hal Dardick is back from the Chicago Tribune, City Hall correspondent. Hal, welcome back. I know you're going to help us understand everything that Rahm Emanuel's dealing with up there on the roster. And also, for the first time joining us on the show today, Tim Novak from the Sun-Times, investigative reporter. And Tim, I'm so glad you're with us, and I'm just such a fan of your work, and I really admire the investigative stuff that the Sun-Times does, and I'm just really happy to have you here. So thanks for coming by. So Hal, let's give you the first word. Food fights erupted over chicken restaurants and food trucks and where they're going to park them and all that kind of stuff. But let's. Do you mind if we start with Chick-fil-A? I mean, I think
it's dominated my life for the last 2 days. So
I know, you've been writing all about it. So Alderman Moreno has decided that in the interest of not offending some of his constituents, he wants to suspend the First Amendment for a while so that he can decide whether a restaurant can get a license or not. Is that unfair?
Well, I think that there certainly is a First Amendment issue. He's saying that he's going to block Chick-fil-A from building a store in his ward along Elston Avenue and Logan Square because of comments that were made by the president of Chick-fil-A, Dan Cathy, who said that he believes in the biblical version of marriage, i.e. between a man and a woman, and made some strong comments like that, and he's taken a lot of flack across the country for being anti-gay as a result.
Except Mike Huckabee, he likes him.
Yes, he does, and they have an unusual protest that they're staging where people are just going to go to Chick-fil-A and eat. And they're going to eat, and that's the protest.
It's an eating.
Yes.
Right.
So, but the thing is, Moreno's going to invoke what we call aldermanic privilege, aldermanic prerogative, whatever you want to term it. And basically, it's the local alderman gets to decide what kind of zoning goes on in his ward, and he's going to say no. To me, and if he does it, I talked to some legal scholars, he does it solely on the basis of his belief that Mr. Cathy's anti-gay, then he will be afoul of the First Amendment, yes. Because Mr. Cathy obviously has a right to speak his mind.
Right. I understand that some parts of the First Amendment are still in effect in many parts of the country, and you can still actually have an opinion about something, and it's okay, I guess. But so at some point they're going to turn this into a zoning issue, though, right? And say that there are traffic issues or something.
Well,
like
that's
that?
the thing, and one of the legal scholars I talked to, actually the dean of Kent College of Law, Hal Krent, and he said, who has a great first name, but he said that if the majority of the council cites traffic or congestion or it doesn't fit in with the neighborhood, things that you can consider in zoning, and that's the main reason that they reject this subdivision of the land that Chick-fil-A needs, that would hold up, despite what Moreno says.
Well, that is going to be a fun one to watch because, I mean, that stretch of Elston Avenue, I mean, it's like an outlot in the Home Depot parking lot that they're looking at, right? Or something like that.
It is. That's exactly what it is.
So you've got Home Depot and you've got Target, and there's like 4 or 5 gigantic strip malls on both sides of Elston Avenue along the river there. To come up with the contorted notion that a fast food restaurant would be incompatible use in that area would be a pretty tough one to come up with, I would think. So.
You might have a tough time making that argument, and I suppose they could go to court and say this is a pretense. Right?
We wouldn't want all that traffic from a from a little chicken restaurant interfering with the Home Depot.
I think the other thing that's important here too is I've been pressing Alderman Moreno and other people have, what evidence do you have that they have discriminated against gay people? I'm not saying it's not out there. It's a big company, but I haven't been able to discern any discrimination. In fact, interestingly enough, as we're taping this morning, the owner of the one Chick-fil-A in the city of Chicago, just off of Michigan Avenue there, issued a press release inviting the mayor to her restaurant and saying, we don't discriminate, we donate to gay and lesbian causes, and it's a franchise, so this is the actual owner of that particular restaurant. So the controversy.
Yeah, it does get complicated, because if it's a franchise agreement, who cares what the owner of the franchise, what his personal beliefs are? But anyway, I guess we kicked that one around enough. But I want to come back and talk about the food trucks and everything else. But I also want to get Tim involved in this conversation. Tim, you just completed a series of just fascinating articles about abuses in the fire and police department of the disability pay program. I mean, it's something that I guess we all understand, that a lot of firefighters and police officers get injured in the line of duty, and it's our responsibility to pay for them because they've done that in service to us. But as with every good thing, there's a few people around the edges who kind of abuse that. And you had some just amazing stories.
Thank you. I'm not necessarily so sure that the people in the system are abusing it, as opposed to the system is set up to be abused.
Interesting difference. Well, okay, so then are you saying that the people who you profiled are?
They're not doing anything wrong. The state law, there's actually a state law that allows a police officer in Chicago who is on disability to work in another job. That's what they're doing.
Well, so I guess that's why we're saying that these are folks who are abusing the system. We're not saying that they're doing something illegal.
Well, but that's the system.
Right.
The system says if you're a cop and you're hurt, you can go work somewhere else until you can come back.
But I mean, the picture that we all have in our mind is the picture of the police officer on his safari in Africa bagging what was it, a rhinoceros or some big game?
It was a hippo.
A hippopotamus. Sorry, I don't know that makes a big difference. But I mean, here's the guy who was injured. And that was many years ago. Well, tell us his story. Just give us a brief.
He was injured about 20 years ago. His story is he was running down some tracks to chase some kids, fell and injured his shoulder, and he's been off of work ever since with his shoulder injury. Most of the police officers who are injured on disability have injuries like that. I think most people would probably think they were shot or stabbed, which is really a minority of the people who are out. Back injuries and shoulder injuries are quite common. He went out on disability. He's been out ever since. He gets about 50 grand a year in disability payments. Every time the salary rises, he gets increases as well. He went to law school, got a law degree, joined the family mortuary business, and has made enough money to take up a hobby of big game hunting.
And he doesn't have to live in Chicago to collect this money,
No,
which he would have to do if he was an active police officer.
His wife was a Chicago police officer as well, and when she retired, they moved to LaPorte, Indiana. There is a great deal of these officers that live out of the city. Up until '07, you had to get permission. Now they just let them go. Which is yet another indication that the system is set up to be abused, because if you were ever called back to work, you have to live in the city to work. So to me, if you've moved to Arizona, you have no designs on ever coming back.
Right. So can you just give me like a thumbnail of how many people are involved in this? How many firefighters and police officers are on? Wait, here's the question I'm trying to ask. How many police and firefighters did you find who are in this category of people who are, let's just say, stretching the thing, versus people who truly are disabled?
Well,
Okay, maybe you can't decide that either, but you know what I'm trying to say.
We couldn't. There are too many to have examined every case. You know, there's people going on disability today, but there's a special classification of police officers who are permanently and totally disabled. And Jim Mullen, the officer everyone is familiar with, who was shot and left a quadriplegic, is one of those 19. Not all of those 19 are permanently and totally disabled. There's a couple of them who are paralyzed, but not all of them are. One of those people actually came out of her house to tell us she had no desire to talk to us, her house in the suburbs. So there are a great deal of these officers who are doing other endeavors, jobs, whatever, and it's all in the files of the police. The police department, the police pension system, which pays these people these disability payments, has all this in their records. They can tell you where these people are working.
So here's the thing that I don't understand, and Hal, maybe you can get in on this too. It's like, I can imagine that every time there's a horrendous event that takes down a police officer or a firefighter, and we all can remember these days when these things happen, you know, when the roof collapses and 3 firefighters are, you know, permanently disabled. There's a kind of a generous spirit to say we've got to make sure we're taking care of these people. And is that what happens, that we sort of ratchet up the benefits and then other people can kind of flood through and get them?
There's, you know, in the data that we've got, there's one officer who's, we didn't pursue this case, but there's one officer whose injury is described as having slipped on a pencil. These are not necessarily, when you say in the line of duty, it's not necessarily that you were engaged in some sort of, you know, shootout with someone. You may have fallen at work. These are on-the-job injuries. They're not necessarily, you know. You can also get disability if you were hurt off the job. It's a lesser standard.
I have to say, that's amazing to me. I don't know. Is that normal? If you were injured at home, would the Tribune cover you for disability?
They want to know when I'd be back to work, but you know that's
well,
about as far as that would go.
But if you were injured at playing football on Saturday, okay, they might not pay you disability, but you would go to the hospital and you would have your work health insurance pay for that.
Yeah, there's disability coverage, and I suppose I would get something for some period of time.
Yeah, but you wouldn't be able to move to Arizona.
Well, you know,
okay.
and I guess that's the question. You know, are these people malingering or are they actually disabled? I don't
Well,
know.
I mean, I think, Tim, you raise a very interesting point here that we must keep in mind throughout this whole conversation, that as sort of grotesque as some of these stories are, they're not illegal. These are people who are working within the framework. But you have this case of, who was it? What was the woman's name? 10 days in the police academy. The guy, Donald Barnes, worked for 10 days in the police academy 14 years ago, and then had some kind of issue. He collapsed while he was running or something. For 14 years, he's been on disability. He never served as a police officer.
Well, actually, never graduated from the academy.
Never graduated, yeah.
Mr. Barnes is an interesting case in that he is the officer on disability who actually has the least amount of service, which is why we wrote about him.
None.
Well, 10 days. The courts have determined that once you enter the academy, they are responsible for you.
Yeah.
The question isn't whether or not Mr. Barnes was injured or whether he was hurt in the academy or what have you. We'll stipulate that he isn't completely a whole person. However, the doctors have indicated that he's perfectly capable of working in a sedentary job, which he actually does work at Standard Parking, which is the company that runs the parking lots for the city at the airports. So the point here, I think, that sometimes is missed, and in the case of Mr. Barnes, many of his, I guess, colleagues have seemed to miss this point, is it's not a question that whether he was or wasn't hurt, it's whether he is capable of doing something else for the city of Chicago.
Right.
And that's an issue that we explored with the Emanuel administration, that you you have a workforce in jobs that often are going to cause them injuries, whether it's a shooting or whether they fall or whether they can't jog the 6 blocks, what have you. If they are unable to come back to that job, do you just pay them forever, or do you find other employment for them that they are capable of doing? Because Mr. Barnes is fully capable. We saw him drive his car, park it in his garage. He's fully capable of
he could be
leading
working
a
for the
normal
city
life.
somewhere.
Absolutely.
Right.
The city's doctors have even said that. So now it's a question of, it's really the city's responsibility to find him a place. I mean, are you going to pay him $50,000 a year to not come back, or are you going to find him some other job for that money?
Well, as you point out, some of these folks are in line to receive up to $1.3 million by the time they retire, if they continue this, just in disability payments.
What if, say, that successful lawyer you talked about, who was injured way back when, and a mortuary guy, and he was offered a job at the city but declined it because it maybe would lower his income. Is he then off disability? What's the result of that?
If the city offered him a job in a legal, say for instance in the law department, if he took it, he would lose his police pension. I mean, his police disability payments would be suspended. So he would, right now he's getting, well, I don't know how many checks he's getting, but he's getting a monthly payment from disability from the city.
Tax-free.
Tax-free, but he would lose that if he came back to work for the city. So he has no desire to do that.
So there's really a disincentive to get people back to work
Right, and he
but,
actually.
but what if they offered him and he declined the job? Would he still be eligible for that disability payment?
For that to have happened, they would have to have determined that he is no longer injured, and they haven't done that. They still maintain that he's incapable of coming back to work as a police officer. So they would have to somehow change their position that he's capable of coming back.
Okay.
And then he's told us if that happened, he would just retire because he's got enough credits, both in terms of longevity and in terms of his age, to retire now.
So he could pull a pension.
But he told us that it's financially beneficial for him to stay on disability until he turns 63 and retire at that point. Because the health insurance is cheaper when you're on disability.
10 very expensive days for the citizens of Chicago.
Well, no, he was actually on the force for about 12 years.
Oh, I'm sorry. We're talking about, we're confusing the people here.
He was talking about Mr. Sidlecki,
Right, that's right,
the safari hunter.
As opposed to Mr. Barnes, yeah. Let's switch gears a little bit here and talk about also police related, but let's talk about the Burge settlement. Hal, that was a big deal. It was kind of like ending with a whimper instead of a bang, I guess, in a way, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it really was, because there was a chance that former Mayor Daley could have been deposed.
Right.
Did anybody really think that was going to happen?
Did anyone think that was going to happen? I don't think so, but there was the possibility, and certainly folks who've been long involved in this case, Flint Taylor, who represented Michael Tillman, were probably itching to do that, if they could, because he was state's attorney, then he was mayor when a lot of this stuff was going on, and there are accusations out there, at least to all of which the former mayor denies, that he was somehow culpable for not stopping this when it was occurring.
We've speculated on this show that on the night that Axelrod patched Daley and Rahm together and said, listen, we're thinking we want to make some switches here, I got to get Rahm out of the White House. And Daley said, okay, I'm ready to go, but the one thing is, you got to do a settlement in the Burge case. So they've done it.
I think you could look at it that way, but I think you can also look at this case of Michael Tillman, who was in jail 23 years for a rape and murder he did not commit. Lost all those years. He ends up getting a settlement that's in the $5.4 million range. That's not unheard of. Had they gone to trial, could a jury have given him $20 million? Did the city settle this strictly because they thought they were going to lose more money if they went to trial? I think you can you could conclude that, you know, that it wasn't a decision based on what would happen to Richard Daley in this case. Although I don't know what goes on in the minds.
Well, they could be related, but I mean, I think it's
There's also, to be more serious about it, I'm sure just a sense in Rahm Emanuel's mind that it's like, I don't want to be mayor for the next 12 years and have this thing hanging over me. I just want this done with. I want this out of the way.
Yeah, actually, Flint Taylor said he wished, he was disappointed that Mayor Emanuel didn't apologize. Well, obviously, Mayor Emanuel wasn't part of the events when this occurred, but his point was that, you know, the African American community where people were tortured, were imprisoned, you know, wrongfully, wants some assurances so that they can move forward. And the mayor made a point about, you know, he wasn't going to apologize, and he didn't address that specifically. He said there's lessons learned. He called it a dark chapter in our history, that he wanted to move on from that chapter. So yeah, I mean, he made it clear, yeah, I want to get, and they're settling a lot of these cases. So he wants to deal with them the best way he can and make that a piece of history rather than contemporary news.
Don't you think sometimes the law department gets in that too, and they say you can't apologize because if you actually use the term apology, it has legal ramifications of some sort that...
I actually asked Flint about that the other day, and he said, well, you know, they get up there and when they make these settlements and they say that, you know, wrongs were committed, you know, they make, although, you know, they didn't admit this guy was tortured, but they said, you know, they say things were done that were wrong, and they note that Burge was convicted, he's in prison, that there was proof that he had committed torture in other cases. So he believes that they could make a general apology without jeopardizing further cases. That's his argument. But, you know, if you're the mayor, you want to risk
Right.
that he's right, maybe not.
Yeah. Well, again, just broadening the scope a little bit further, that brings us kind of in a weird way around to the Kochman case, which is moving forward in a rapid way. There have been a couple of developments in that, with Dan Webb talking about impaneling a grand jury now, right?
Well, the grand jury's been seated for a few weeks now. Webb acknowledged that last week that there is a grand jury meeting in his offices.
Is that important that it's meeting in his offices?
I don't know if it's important that it's meeting in his offices. It's important that it isn't meeting where it would normally meet. So normally they would meet in the criminal courts building at 26th in California, where the state's attorney controls that room. The state's attorney's office is a critical player in this case.
Sure is, yeah.
So this was done to keep them out of the loop.
I mean, that seems important to me in some way.
Well,
that you
there's
have to
people
do this.
there's people from the state's attorney's office who theoretically or most likely are going to be subpoenaed to testify before that grand jury.
Just, I mean, for viewers not familiar with what we're talking about the David Kochman case, who died after an altercation some years ago, and I guess we all kind of familiar with the general.
He was framed for his own death.
That's right. Yeah. So, do we have reason to believe that justice might actually prevail here? That there will be a fair hearing of this, and that a decision that we'll get to the bottom of the case?
It's been a long time. I guess there's hope, but there's no assurances of anything. I don't even know what. It's really still murky as to what happened. There's an overriding question of how is it that the police couldn't determine 8 years ago that Daley's nephew did this, but then they could do it last year without any additional evidence. So at what point did they decide, we'll just say he did it, and why did you do that if you couldn't do it 8 years earlier?
Right.
You might remember there was also a big investigation into the Burge case at the state level that ended up without any charges.
That's
later
true.
The Fed stepped in and something happened.
And then there were that was partly because the it had been too late, right? Too late to.
Yeah, they
charge
talked
us.
about the statute of
Had
limitations.
run out.
There is no statute of limitations in this case, though.
Right.
And as Judge Tooman, who appointed Dan Webb as the special prosecutor, has pointed out, there is a dead body. Somebody did it.
Yeah. Okay, let's lighten things up and talk about food trucks.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's been a 2-year battle at City Hall. People that operate these food trucks, and they wanted to cook on the trucks. They couldn't legally do that before, and they wanted, a set of rules under which they could operate. And from their perspective, I think it's a case of beware of what you wish for, because they say the rules are too onerous, that they can't operate within 200 feet of a brick and mortar restaurant. And when you go downtown, it's pretty hard to get 200 feet away from a brick and mortar restaurant. They think they set up 5 food stands, 2 trucks per stand in various locations. Well, they have yet to determine where those will be, but they're going to have those. And the people that operate these trucks say it's not. It's really weighted towards the bricks and mortar.
Yeah.
We're not getting a fair shot at doing this. It's not going to enliven the scene, and we could get fined $1,000 if we're too close to the restaurant. And that wipes out a day, more than a day's worth of proceeds. It could wipe out the business.
It really does seem crazy that it's like, well, here's the good news. We're going to let you cook on the trucks, and we're going to remove a lot of the restrictions on food trucks. The bad news is you just can't do it downtown. I mean, basically, you can't be anywhere near where all your customers are. I mean, I don't know.
Well, they'll have these 10 locations, but the food operators say, well, there are going to be other trucks circling, like vultures waiting for that spot, or
for that one or 2 spots in the loop. And it is weird, because if you go to other cities, they seem to have made this accommodation a long time ago. Chicago seems to be very far behind in accommodating this, but you can certainly see
the 32nd city.
The 30,
and that's not my own coinage. Actually, the mayor said that yesterday.
Is that right?
He said we're known as the second city, and in this case, unfortunately, the 32nd. City,
Well, I mean, you certainly can see the case that the brick and mortar guys make, that they have this huge investment in their physical plant, and all of a sudden somebody can just plop down in front and steal their customers. But on the other hand,
well, they have other things to offer too. I don't know. I don't know the business that well, but they don't. In the food trucks, you can't get air conditioning. There's no bathrooms. There's other things that draw people to a bricks and mortar establishment. Some people say that in other cities where it's been done, it enlivens the whole scene, and everybody benefits.
Yeah. Well, I was in Portland about a year ago, and that certainly was the case there. I mean, they were just everywhere. They actually were letting them use empty lots, so they were like the big clusters. Well, guys, thank you so much for bringing us up to date on this week in Chicago. It's a kind of an interesting time that we're in right now, and we still haven't figured out anything to do with the CPS and whether there's going to be a strike or not. So, one word: is there going to be a strike?
No.
No.
Not if the mayor can avoid it.
He'll avoid it.
That's more than one word.
He'll avoid it. He's got to avoid it. Hal Dardick from the Tribune, thank you so much for being with us today. And Tim Novak from the Sun-Times, a pleasure having you both on the show with us today. You have been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV, as you probably know, and you know that you can find us here on cable all the time. But if you want to watch the show specifically, like right now, just go to this address and you can watch it any old time you want online. So it's kind of a cool thing. You can check us out there. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes. You can do the video podcast or the audio podcast, and it's a very hip thing to do, to be walking along the lakefront listening to Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis, thanking you so much for being with us, and we will see you again right back here next week on Chicago Newsroom. Thanks. Take it easy.